Hi and welcome to Manibil. I am heading into part 4 of David Hume's book, A Treatise of Human Nature from 1739, and part 4 has the title of the Skeptical and Other Systems of Philosophy. And the first section is called Of Skepticism with Regard to Reason. So why not just hit the road and don't come back no more, right?
File 32 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 4 of the Skeptical and Other Systems of Philosophy. Section 1 of Skepticism with Regard to Reason. In all demonstrative sciences, the rules are certain and infallible. But when we apply them, our fallible and uncertain faculties are very apt to depart from them and fall into error. We must, therefore, in every reasoning, form a new judgment as a check or control on our first judgment or belief, and must enlarge our view.
He starts out a section or a potentially a part talking about uncertainty. So that's not particularly skeptic, right? But okay. I don't particularly like the idea of certainty, but I've fleshed that out in other parts where I've discussed that, so let that be. But listen, if philosophy, what is philosophy? Philosophy is a kind of thinking, and it's a kind of meta-thinking, in the sense that when you philosophize, you think about how you think, to use think as the broad term here, right? You think about how you think, right? And that sort of entails every part of the thinking. It's foundational stuff we are dealing with, right? And that foundational stuff is also a foundation of science. Scientific or, demonstrative science or whatever he wants to call it. So if he says that philosophy in some regard or another, there's some, uncertainty about faculties or whatever, right? Then he's basically saying that the foundations of that which is certain is uncertain, right? So this is sort of built into the way he argues here, and that's not particularly well structured, in my opinion, right? It seems to me that he has some, in his philosophy, he has some pet subjects that he's very concerned about. And, I have that too, but I make sure that my focus is on everything I can possibly philosophize about, and that needs to be philosophized about, right? That he has some pet subjects that like cause and effect, and he can knock himself out of the water spending 100 pages on that, whatever, right? And then make statements like this that are not thought through very well, in my opinion. But these are just, I'm just right that to get to my next pet subject, so to say, right? So the quality of his philosophy is uneven, that he knocks himself out in all sorts of things, for instance, in causality, and then the quality level, when he gets to something that is not a pet subject, is sort of, okay, I'm just fill in the blanks here, and then I'll get to my next pet subject, so to say. That's sort of what I'm seeing a bit, right? Okay.
To comprehend a kind of history of all the instances wherein our understanding has deceived us compared with those wherein its testimony was just and true. Our reason must be considered as a kind of cause, of which truth is the natural effect, but such a one as by the eruption of other causes and by the inconstancy of our mental powers, may frequently be prevented. By this means, all knowledge degenerates into probability, and this probability is greater or less according to our experience of the veracity or deceitfulness of our understanding and according to the simplicity or intricacy of the question.
Okay, so probability is in some way not in the sense that I'm not sure how much mathematical probability they were doing back in the early 1700s. I don't necessarily think too much, right? It's one of the newer ends of mathematics as far as I'm concerned, right? Combinatorics and so on. I think it was a part of mathematics back then, but it was not as fully formed and respectable as it is now, right? So when he says probability, I would at this point say that either it cannot be the case, and or it cannot be known, maybe, right? You could say maybe something is the case. You could operate with the idea of something could be the case without you knowing it, right? Though it approaches a contradiction, right? But there's something that cannot be the case because it's ruled out of philosophy, right? That there might something that could be the case but isn't the case now, right? I'm not experiencing elephant, but I'm sort of convinced that because I have the idea of elephant, I could experience elephant, right? Though it's a complex idea, according to Hume, so it might be imagined. I can't, I only have a memory and so on, right? Maybe you could say that if it's a part of your memory, then you could experience it, right? If you create a unicorn, doesn't mean that it's necessarily experiential or could be experienced. Though you could create this complex idea out of some simple ideas, right? So the only way to say if there's something that you could know but don't know at the moment is that you have a memory of it. Then there's this idea of certainty. And that's usually quite problematic in my opinion, because as far as I'm concerned, certainty is a pipe dream. It's an imagined authoritarian approach to knowledge. And what I'm particularly concerned about is empiricists talking about certainty, right? And when they talk about empiricism, they're sort of, you have to have these impressions or sensations or something like that in order to have knowledge. Well, okay. Well, then you can't have certainty, because if you're talking about the past or the future in any shape or form, you won't have any sensations, right? You will either have memory or imagination, right? So if you can't have empiricism about the past and you can't have empiricism about the future, then you are in the now. And if you're talking about something being certain, you are stretching the knowledge of that particular aspect into both the past and the future. But how can you possibly do that if you don't have empirical data about it, right? So these aspects are not fully developed by Hume, and neither by anybody else I seem to have come across, right? So
there is no algebraist nor mathematician so expert in his science as to place entire confidence in any truth immediately upon his discovery of it, or regard it as...
might be a twist of words here, right? But algebra and mathematics is not science. It's not science. It's like saying somebody who likes to use a hammer is a carpenter, right? If I take a hammer and just, hammer is a tool that a carpenter uses, right? So it's like they use a lot of tools in order to do carpentry, right? algebra is a part of the scientific method, or one of the tools used when you're doing science, right? In order to calculate this, that, and the other, the quantifications of your experiments and so on, right? But that's not science then. Then it's a tool for science, right? And I like when these aspects are fleshed out in a way that is coherent. Now, it's 300 years ago since Hume wrote this. So there's, things have been clarified further since then, right? So I'm not bashing Hume, but I'm pointing out various aspects that might be important to kind of think about when you read a text like Hume's here, right?
It's anything but a mere probability. Every time he runs over his proofs, his confidence increases, but still more by the approbation of his friends, and is raised to its utmost perfection by the universal assent and applauses of the learned world. Now it is evident that this gradual increase of assurance is nothing but the addition of new probabilities, and is derived from the constant union of causes and effects, according to past experience and observation. In accompts of any length or importance, merchants seldom trust to the infallible certainty of numbers for their security, but by the artificial structure of the accompts produce a probability beyond what is derived from the skill and experience of the accomptant. For that is plainly of itself some degree of probability, though uncertain and variable according to the degrees of his experience and length of the accompt. Now, as none will maintain that our assurance in a long numeration exceeds probability, I may safely affirm that there scarce is any proposition concerning numbers of which we can have a fuller security. For it is easily possible, by gradually diminishing the numbers, to reduce the longest series of addition to the most simple question which can be formed, to an addition of two single numbers. And upon this supposition, we shall find it impracticable to shew the precise limits of knowledge and of probability, or discover that particular number at which the one ends and the other begins. But knowledge and probability are of such contrary and disagreeing natures that they cannot well run insensibly into each other, and that because they will not divide, but must be either entirely present or entirely absent. Besides, if any single addition were certain, every one would be so, and consequently the whole or total sum, unless the whole can be different from all its parts. I had almost said that this was certain, but I reflect that it must reduce itself, as well as every other reasoning, and from knowledge degenerate into probability.
I don't think he has mentioned why he has the idea of certainty. So there is a bit of sort of midstream philosophy about Hume. He's very concerned about various things that has to be, meticulously philosophized to the nth degree almost, right? And other things that just arrives basically sort of, that's sort of course, I talk about certainty, right? So that's the unevenness of his philosophy I was, referring to before, right? Certainty, if that's possible, I would very much like him to spend a couple of pages on an idea of why he uses, if certainty is possible, I am taking sort of implicitly for granted that there's something, you should deal with called certainty. But what would it actually be, right? If you have knowledge, isn't that good enough, right? Can you upgrade that knowledge to something more than that? By what standard, right? That's an elephant. I point and I experience elephant. Okay. Is it certain? How would I know, man, right? Should I have these colors and sounds and this cognition of elephant? I can't know, right? I can know if why, or if I should, why I experience, and if I should experience whatever, right? I can just say I experienced that, and I can make a proposition about it potentially, right? But I don't know if I should or shouldn't experience that. I can never get to any explanation like that. So, I mean, by that standard alone, certainty is fucking impossible, right? It's ridiculous. And why would you need this kind of upgrade to some glorified kind of knowledge? I don't know. Is it to say, yeah, you might think you know, but I am certain, right? It's this sort of appeal to authority. Sense that between the lines, right? I'm not saying necessarily Hume does that, but in general, I have a sense that it's, but it's certain, you know. It's like, okay, so then we can't discuss, right, anymore, right? It's sort of, hey, QED, right? Fuck off. And I don't see any good arguments. And I've never seen good arguments for certainty. And if you have seen one, please enlighten me. Let me know where you've seen it and how you do it, right? So yeah, let us hear what Hume has to say.
Since, therefore, all knowledge resolves itself into probability and becomes at last of the same nature with that evidence which we employ in common life, we must now examine this latter species of reasoning and see on what foundation it stands. In every judgment which we can form concerning probability as well as concerning knowledge, we ought always to correct the first judgment derived from the nature of the object by another judgment derived from the nature of the understanding. It is certain a man of solid sense and long experience ought to have, and usually has, a greater assurance in his opinions than one that is foolish and ignorant, and that our sentiments have different degrees of authority, even with ourselves, in proportion to the degrees of our reason and experience. In the man of the best sense and longest experience, this authority is never entire, since even such a one must be conscious of many errors in the past, and must still dread the like for the future. Here then arises a new species of probability to correct and regulate the first, and fix its just standard and proportion. As demonstration is subject to the control of probability, so is probability liable to a new correction by a reflex act of the mind, wherein the nature of our understanding and our reasoning from the first probability become our objects. Having thus found in every probability, beside the original uncertainty inherent in the subject, a new uncertainty derived from the weakness of that faculty which judges, and having adjusted these two together, we are obliged by our reason to add a new doubt derived from the possibility of error in the estimation we make of the truth and fidelity of our faculties. This is a doubt which immediately occurs to us, and of which, if we would closely pursue our reason, we cannot avoid giving a decision. But this decision, though it should be favorable to our preceding judgment, being founded only on probability, must weaken still further our first evidence, and must itself be weakened by a fourth doubt of the same kind, and so on in infinitum, till at last there remain nothing of the original probability, however great we may suppose it to have been, and however small the diminution by every new uncertainty. No finite object can subsist under a decrease repeated in infinitum, and even the vastest quantity which can enter into human imagination must in this manner be reduced to nothing. Let our first belief be never so strong, it must infallibly perish by passing through so many new examinations, of which each diminishes somewhat of its force and vigor. When I reflect on the natural fallibility of my judgment, I have less confidence in my opinions than when I only consider the objects concerning which I reason. And when I proceed still further to turn the scrutiny against every successive estimation I make of my faculties, all the rules of logic require a continual diminution, and at last a total extinction of belief and evidence. Should it here be...
I am quite dumbfounded what he's talking about here, talking about infinite arguments that, yeah, well, what do they do? I'm kind of lost in this, but I will be heading on anyway, right? He must be, usually starts out chapters by being very some grand and then sort of focuses more and more, right? So I'll hope that he focuses a bit more here.
He asked me whether I sincerely assent to this argument, which I seem to take such pains to inculcate, and whether I be really one of those skeptics who hold that all is uncertain and that our judgment is not in anything possessed of any measures of truth and falsehood.
Okay, that's more like it, right? Whether I sincerely assent, should I be asked, it here be asked me whether I sincerely assent to this argument, which I seem to take such pains to inculcate, and whether I be really one of those skeptics who hold that all is uncertain, and that our judgment is not in anything possessed of any measures of truth and falsehood. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful, right? Now he's sort of, okay, there are these people who say this out there, right? And they think that I might be like that. Okay, let's see how he deals with it as we go along later here. But all is uncertain. Well, what is all then, right? Maybe it's better to say, I cannot find anything to call certain by any standard I would think of as certain. If I have knowledge, I consider that the deepest insight I can have in that what I consider a representation of an outside. It can't get any better than knowledge. And that is a concept I'm experiencing in the now, like that elephant I'm pointing at now. There is an elephant here, right? So I guess you have to trust me. But if I say that's an elephant and I experience elephant, I have knowledge. It can't get any more certain than that. What would it be, man? I mean, what would it be? Would it be, yeah, but I saw that elephant yesterday, so now it's more certain? That's just based on some kind of, magical inference from having a memory of some other experience, right? Which might not be, had been correct, even if you had the experience. Just because you might not, that fox I remembered or I referred to in an earlier part, which I experienced a fox, and then after a couple of seconds, it turned into a beagle. If I turned my head after 1 second, I would be convinced I saw a fox, right? Still, because I didn't reach a point where it could change. So I would have a memory of a fox. So if I see that beagle again, I might say, yeah, now I'm certain it's a fox. After that 1 second again, because I saw that fox yesterday, right? You can't get to this kind of certainty. It's a fetish of authority, in my opinion, where somebody can sit there on their chair and say, this is certain, now do as you're told, right? Its certainty is an inevitable category in order to order people around, right? If you're not certain, who are you to, boss people around, right? And there's also a tendency to people, some crazy people are so convinced of them being right and convincing other people that they're certain, that people flock to them because of their supposed certainty, right? They're so convinced of their weird ideas that they come across as completely certain about, and other people are more like, yeah, I'm not sure, but that person over there is certain, so I better follow them, something like that, right? Be careful with certainty. Be very careful, right?
I should reply that this question is entirely superfluous, and that neither
I forgot to mention that, in my opinion, truth and false, right? And I don't like that he calls it truth and falsehood. There's no hyphen between truth and. So it's not truthhood and falsehood shortened down. So there's truth and there's falsehood, right? There is telling the truth or lying, right? That's not a good way of handling the idea of true and false. In my opinion, true and false is as I stated earlier, I think, that if you make a proposition, the way you know that it's a proposition, there might be other criteria, but one of the ways you know it's a proposition is that you can only answer yes or no, and in some rare cases, I don't know, right? Or I can't tell you, maybe you can't say I don't know. It depends on the terms, maybe, right? And your use of the term knowledge. But it's usually true or false, right? If I point and say, that's an elephant, either you experience elephant or you don't experience elephant. So either that proposition is true or false to you, right? It's not true or falsehood. If I say, that's an elephant, and you don't, and you look in that direction, or you supposed spot where it's supposed to be according to, my proposition, and you're saying, I don't experience an elephant, are you being, is that falsehood? No, it's just the correct conclusion to the proposition, right? So there's some underlying things built into this that seems like it's not sufficiently thought through, right?
neither I nor any other person was ever sincerely and constantly of that opinion. Nature, by an absolute and uncontrollable necessity, has determined us to judge as well as to breathe and feel. Nor can we any more forbear viewing certain objects in a stronger and fuller light upon account of their customary connection with the present impression than we can hinder ourselves from thinking as long as we are awake, or seeing the surrounding bodies when we turn our eyes toward them in broad sunshine. Whoever has taken the pains to refute the cavils of this total skepticism has really disputed without an antagonist, and endeavored by arguments to establish a faculty which nature has antecedently implanted in the mind and rendered unavoidable. My intention, then, in displaying so carefully the arguments of that fantastic sect, is only to make the reader sensible of the truth of my hypothesis, that all our reasonings concerning causes and effects are derived from nothing but custom, and that belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cogitative part of our natures. I have here proved that the very same principles which make us form a decision upon any subject, and correct that decision by the consideration of our genius and capacity, and of the situation of our mind when we examine that subject, I say, I have proved that these same principles, when carried farther and applied to every new reflex judgment, must, by continually diminishing the original evidence, at last reduce it to nothing, and utterly subvert all belief and opinion. If belief, therefore, were a simple act of the thought, without any peculiar manner of conception, or the addition of a force and vivacity, it must infallibly destroy itself, and in every case terminate in a total suspense of judgment. But as experience will sufficiently convince anyone who thinks it worthwhile to try, that though he can find no error in the foregoing arguments, yet he still continues to believe and think and reason as usual, he may safely conclude that his reasoning and belief is some sensation or peculiar manner of conception which it is impossible for mere ideas and reflections to destroy. But here, perhaps, it may be demanded how it happens, even upon my hypothesis, that these arguments above explained produce not a total suspense of judgment, and after what manner the mind ever retains a degree of assurance in any subject. For as these new probabilities, which by their repetition perpetually diminish the original evidence, are founded on the very same principles, whether of thought or sensation, as the primary judgment, it may seem unavoidable that in either case they must equally subvert it, and by the opposition either of contrary thoughts or sensations, reduce the mind to a total uncertainty. I suppose there is some question proposed to me, and that after revolving over the impressions of my memory and senses, and carrying my thoughts from them to such objects as are commonly conjoined with them, I feel a stronger and more forcible conception on the one side than on the other. This strong conception forms my first decision. I suppose that afterwards I examine my judgment itself, and observing from experience that it is sometimes just and sometimes erroneous, I consider it as regulated by contrary principles or causes, of which some lead to truth and some to error. And in balancing these contrary,
Now there's a conflation of incompatible concepts or ideas. Use of terms. Truth is not opposed to error. So I know it's 300 years old. I still keep that in mind, right? But I want to express that alone could be a source of misunderstandings, right? Truth is not opposed to error. An error is an error compared to some standard, right? And if it's not following the standard, there's some error, right? But true is a conclusion about a proposition compared with your experience, right? And that experience is a concept, in my opinion, which is elephant, for instance, or tomato, whatever it is, bicycle, right? When you point and say that's a bicycle, then I can say true or false, right? I cannot say true or error, because that would be like saying, no, there's something wrong with your experience or something like that. Well, how could I possibly do that? I don't have access to your mind, which is known as the problem of the mind, or zombie problem, or something like that, right? So I know that may be beyond Hume, but it's sort of, I'm trying not to be too hard on Hume, but also, try to help listeners, and myself for that matter, avoid putting too much emphasis in particular aspects of Hume, because they might be misunderstood or have changed their idea over the centuries and so on, right? So just sort of keep this in mind, but that doesn't mean I can't point out various aspects that I find to be bad descriptions by today's standards, so to say.
causes, I diminish by a new probability the assurance of my first decision. This new probability is liable to the same diminution as the foregoing, and so on in infinitum. It is therefore demanded how it happens that even after all we retain a degree of belief, which is sufficient for our purpose, either in philosophy or common life. I answer that after the first and second decision, as the action of the mind becomes forced and unnatural, and the ideas faint and obscure, though the principles of judgment and the balancing of opposite causes be the same as at the very beginning, yet their influence on the imagination and the vigor they add to or diminish from the thought is by no means equal. Where the mind reaches not its objects with easiness and facility, the same principles have not the same effect as in a more natural conception of the ideas. Nor does the imagination feel a sensation which holds any proportion with that which arises from its common judgments and opinions. The attention is on the stretch. The posture of the mind is uneasy, and the spirits being diverted from their natural course are not governed in their movements by the same laws, at least not to the same degree as when they flow in their usual channel. If we
Yeah, so I think that's fairly important, that he's stating obviously that how the mind works sort of behind the curtain of ideas and impression, which he has quite clearly pointed out you can't get to, is of another nature than that which the impressions are trying to present, so to say, right? That's more put into particular, cause and effect and laws and the mathematics, the geometry, and so on. But the mind can go sort of basically anywhere it wants, maybe, right? And only your awareness can stop it from doing that. So that's sort of what I'm hearing, right? And I'm on board with that. But this is sort of maybe some that could be early introductory things. Why is it here? It's kind of this bloated text here. Get to the point, man. Come on, man. You can do it.
desire similar instances, it will not be very difficult to find them. The present subject of metaphysics will supply us abundantly.
Okay, metaphysics. Okay, now he's bringing in the guns, right? Okay, metaphysics. So now he's calling it metaphysics. So skepticism is a kind of metaphysics. Yeah, okay. I'm not sure about what he's trying to say, but okay, I'll let it pass for now.
The same argument which would have been esteemed convincing in a reasoning concerning history or politics has little or no influence in these abstruser subjects, even though it be perfectly comprehended, and that because there is required a study and an effort of thought in order to its being comprehended. And this effort of thought disturbs the operation of our sentiments on which the belief depends. The case is the same in other subjects. The straining of the imagination always hinders the regular flowing of the passions and sentiments. A tragic poet that would represent his heroes as very ingenious and witty in their misfortunes would never touch the passions. As the emotions of the soul prevent any subtle reasoning and reflection, so these latter actions of the mind are equally prejudicial to the former. The mind, as well as the body, seems to be endowed with a certain precise degree of force and activity which it never employs in one action, but at the expense of all the rest. This is more evidently true where the actions are of quite different natures, since in that case the force of the mind is not only diverted, but even the disposition changed, so as to render us incapable of a sudden transition from one action to the other, and still more of performing both at once. No wonder, then, the conviction which arises from a subtle reasoning diminishes in proportion to the efforts which the imagination makes to enter into the reasoning and to conceive it in all its parts. Belief, being a lively conception, can never be entire where it is not founded on something natural and easy. This I take to be the true state of the question, and cannot approve of that expeditious way which some take with the skeptics, to reject at once all their arguments without inquiry or examination. If the skeptical reasonings be strong, say they, it is a proof that reason may have some force and authority. If weak, they can never be sufficient to invalidate all the conclusions of our understanding. This argument is not just, because the skeptical reasonings, were it possible for them to exist, and were...
So it's trying to create a dilemma here, or the anti-skeptics are trying to create a dilemma. Is that not what it's called? If the skeptical reasonings be strong, who decides? It is a proof that reason may have some force and authority. If the skeptical reasonings are weak, they can never be sufficient to invalidate all the conclusions of our understanding. No, but our understanding is sort of the built-in idea that we think that we know this and that and the other without having scrutinized that we think how we got to that insight, whatever that be. Then the skeptic is trying to turn all the pages and look at all the shelves and check out, where did I get that, and how did I cite by this, and how did I get that understanding? It's sort of, I guess, in Hume's terminology here, skepticism is just bringing reasonings to bear, right? How do you reason for this? And as considering myself a skeptic, at least in this sense here, right? Whenever on Twitter or YouTube or whatever, wherever that may be, on a blog or wherever, right? When people make some bold statements of this, that, and the other, then I ask a question about, okay, so how do you define that? Or how do you define this? Or how did you get that? And how do you understand that? And people back off, like I say, I don't have to answer you, which is sort of implied by the way they respond. I'm saying, okay, but then you're using that term, but you don't want to really define it or clarify what you mean and so on, right? So you don't like skepticism about whatever it is you're not skeptical. How did you reason for this, that, and the other, right? It's just something that you like to be the case, or something along those lines, right? Hume is of that nature, where he says, okay, I am searching my own ideas of what I think how I understand and so on, and try to dig deep and see what is it based on. And if that is the skepticism, well, I'm fully on board, right? Because that's actually being a philosopher. In that sense, that skepticism is that which ignites necessity for being a rigid philosopher. That's basically what it is, right? So I don't think this is sort of trying to create this dilemma here, right? Or a potential paradox and appeal to that. That sounds sophist, right? So I'm agreeing with Hume.
Were they not destroyed by their subtlety, would be successively both strong and weak, according to the successive dispositions of the mind. Reason first appears in possession of the throne, prescribing laws and imposing maxims with an absolute sway and authority. Her enemy, therefore, is obliged to take shelter under her protection, and by making use of rational arguments to prove the fallaciousness and imbecility of reason, produces in a manner a patent under her hand and seal. This patent has at first an authority proportioned to the present and immediate authority of reason from which it is derived. But as it is supposed to be contradictory to reason, it gradually diminishes the force of that governing power and its own at the same time, till at last they both vanish away into nothing by a regular and just diminution. The skeptical and dogmatical reasons are of the same kind, though contrary in their operation and tendency, so that where the latter is strong, it has an enemy of equal force in the former to encounter. And as their forces were at first equal, they still continue so as long as either of them subsists. Nor does one of them lose any force in the contest without taking as much from its antagonist. It is happy, therefore, that nature breaks the force of all skeptical arguments in time, and keeps them from having any considerable influence on the understanding. Were we to trust entirely to their self-destruction, that can never take place until they have first subverted all conviction and have totally destroyed human reason.
Okay, let me take
End of file 32.
another look at that last bit. It is happy, therefore, that nature breaks the force of all skeptical arguments in time, and keeps them from having any considerable influence on their understanding. Were we to trust entirely to their self-destruction, that can never take place until they have first subverted all conviction and have totally destroyed human reason. I'm not sure I can follow that, what he's trying to get at. It sounds bombastic to me, right? There was something else I think it was this one. The this one, I think. The skeptical and dogmatical reasons are of the same kind, though contrary in their operation and tendency. So skepticism and dogmatism is of the same kind, though contrary in their operation and tendency, so that where the latter is strong, it has an enemy of equal force in the former to encounter. And as their forces were of first equal, they still continue so as long as either of them subsists, nor does one of them lose any force in the contest without taking as much from its antagonist. Yeah, maybe. The dogmatic is some. I have been told this is the case, therefore I'm going with it. And the skeptical says, no, I'm going to scrutinize everything I consider that I know and know me used in this context in a broad term, right? In a broad sense. I don't know about this. I mean, let's get rolling, right? What's the skepticism with regard to the senses? Okay, that sounds like something that is going to be more fleshed out, something that is easier to handle, right? This sort of sounded like a very big and bloated and bombastic section, this section 1, right? So, okay, please share, like, and subscribe. Let me have your comment, and consider a donation. Otherwise, see you in the next one.